Every night Jake Thompson stood in the shadows, invisible to the world. A security guard in a dark blue uniform, stationed outside a towering government building. He was just another face lost in the crowd, forgotten, overlooked. But one night, everything changed. As the cold wind whispered through the empty streets, headlights pierced the darkness. A black car pulled up, its presence subtle yet commanding. The door creaked open, and out stepped a man whose name echoed through generations, a legend carved into the fabric of American history, Clint Eastwood. At first, it was nothing more than a fleeting glance, a nod from a man known for his silence. But what happened next would alter Jake's life in ways he could never have imagined. Clint saw something in him, something no one else had ever noticed. A spark, a shadow of potential hidden beneath years of routine and regret. One simple question from Eastwood became the catalyst for a chain of events that would test Jake's courage, his instincts, and ultimately his destiny. What did Clint Eastwood see in this forgotten guard? And how did it lead to a decision that would shock everyone? This isn't just a story about chance, it's about what happens when opportunity knocks, and you're brave enough to open the door. Jake Thompson was the kind of man the world had forgotten, even though he had once fought to protect it. A former soldier who served 8 long years in the military, Jake had seen the harshest corners of the world, dusty battlefields, unforgiving deserts, and skies lit by more gunfire than stars. He had faced danger head-on, standing tall with courage etched into every scar on his body. But none of that mattered when he came home. In the civilian world, Jake was just another face in the crowd. No parades, no applause, just silence. The discipline and skills that had kept him alive overseas now seemed useless behind the sterile walls of a government building. His job as a security guard paid the bills, but it stripped him of purpose. Standing alone in endless corridors, watching others pass by, politicians, businessmen, people who shaped the future, while he remained a nameless shadow in the background. Every night, he wore the same uniform, patrolled the same hallways, and greeted the same indifferent faces. The echoes of his footsteps were a constant reminder of the life he'd left behind, a life filled with meaning, now replaced by routine. His reflection in the glass doors wasn't that of a hero. It was a man slowly fading into obscurity. Jake had tried to move up, applying for better positions, hoping someone would see beyond the badge on his chest. But the world had a way of looking past men like him. To them, he was just security, nothing more, nothing less. Yet deep inside, the fire hadn't gone out. It was buried under disappointment and doubt, but it was still there, waiting for a reason to burn bright again. Little did Jake know that reason was about to arrive, hidden behind the sharp gaze of a legend named Clint Eastwood. It was just another night for Jake Thompson, cold, quiet, and forgettable. The city hummed faintly in the distance, but here, in front of the towering government building, time seemed to stand still. Jake adjusted his uniform, his breath visible in the frosty air as he resumed his usual post, another shift where nothing ever happened, or so he thought. At exactly midnight, the low growl of an engine broke the silence. A sleek black car rolled into the courtyard, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Jake didn't flinch. VIPs came and went all the time, none ever noticing the guard in the corner. But this time was different. The car door swung open with slow, deliberate force, and out stepped a man whose presence was impossible to ignore. Clint Eastwood. His silhouette was unmistakable. Tall, rugged, with an aura of authority that didn't need words to be felt. Dressed in a simple dark coat, he didn't have to say a thing to command attention. His reputation did that for him. Jake stood at attention, his posture perfect, eyes forward. He expected Eastwood to walk past like everyone else, but he didn't. Clint stopped. His sharp eyes met Jake's, piercing through the layers of indifference Jake had worn like armor for years. It wasn't just a glance. It was the look of someone sizing up a man, reading more than what was on the surface. Jake's heart skipped a beat, but his face remained stoic. Clint took a step closer. "How's the night treating you, officer?" Jake blinked, caught off guard. In all his years standing here, no one of Clint's stature had ever spoken to him. Not like this. He cleared his throat, steadying his voice. "All good, sir." But Clint didn't move on. Instead, he studied Jake with an intensity that felt both uncomfortable and meaningful. His gaze wasn't just polite curiosity. It was like he was searching for something, and whatever it was, he found it. You served, didn't you? Jake's breath hitched. There was no badge, no insignia, nothing to give it away, just his stance, his discipline, the way he held himself. Clint had seen it all in a single glance. Yes, sir. 8 years in the Army. Clint nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. 8 years, and now you're here. Those words hit harder than Jake expected. They weren't condescending, but they carried weight, a mirror reflecting back the question Jake had been avoiding for years. Is this all there is? But Clint wasn't done. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You ever think about how secure this place really is? Jake hesitated. Was this a test? A joke? Or something else entirely? He chose his words carefully. I believe we do our best to keep it safe, sir. Clint tilted his head, his iconic squint sharpening. Doing your best doesn't always mean it's enough. Before Jake could respond, Clint straightened up, gave a faint nod, and turned toward the building. But just as he reached the steps, he stopped, glancing over his shoulder. When I come back, I want to hear your thoughts. And with that, Clint Eastwood disappeared into the building, leaving Jake standing there, heart racing, mind spinning. For the first time in years, Jake wasn't invisible, and he knew deep down that this wasn't just a conversation. It was the start of something bigger, something he couldn't afford to ignore. The encounter with Clint Eastwood echoed in Jake Thompson's mind long after the man had vanished into the building. When I come back, I want to hear your thoughts. Those words weren't just a passing remark. They felt like an assignment, a challenge wrapped in casual conversation. But why? Why would a legend like Clint Eastwood care about the opinions of a nameless security guard? Jake couldn't shake it off. That night, as he patrolled the empty hallways, his mind wasn't on the surveillance cameras or the locked doors. It was on Clint's piercing gaze, the way he seemed to see right through him, past the uniform, past the years of unnoticed service. For the first time in forever, Jake felt visible. Days passed, but the memory lingered like an itch he couldn't scratch. Was Clint serious? Most people would have shrugged it off, convinced it was nothing. But Jake wasn't most people. Something deep inside told him this was more than small talk. It was an opportunity, one he couldn't afford to miss, so Jake got to work. Long after his shifts ended, he stayed late, poring over the building's security systems. He studied surveillance footage, reviewed entry logs, and analyzed the layout with a critical eye honed from years in the military. He wasn't just looking for flaws, he was hunting for them. The blind spots no one noticed, the vulnerabilities hidden beneath layers of complacency. He scribbled notes on scraps of paper, sketches of floor plans, lists of weaknesses, ideas for improvements. His once routine nights turned into missions, fueled by a single question. What would Clint Eastwood expect from me? But with every note he jotted down, doubt crept in. Who am I to think I can fix this? I'm just a guard. The weight of that thought nearly crushed him. He wasn't some high-ranking officer or security expert. He was the guy holding the door open, the man people barely noticed as they passed. But then he'd hear Clint's voice in his head, steady and sharp. Doing your best doesn't always mean it's enough. That wasn't criticism, it was a challenge. 3 weeks later, just when Jake thought he'd never see him again, Clint Eastwood returned. The same car, the same quiet authority. But this time Clint didn't walk past. He stopped right in front of Jake. I told you I wanted to hear your thoughts, Clint said, his tone flat but firm. You ready? Jake felt his heart pound like a drum in his chest. This was it, the moment he'd been obsessing over. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and nodded. Yes, sir. I'm ready. And for the first time, Jake wasn't just a security guard standing watch. He was a man standing at the edge of something bigger than himself, a challenge that could either pull him out of obscurity or prove that he was meant for more. Jake Thompson had faced pressure before, on battlefields where life and death decisions were made in seconds. But this felt different. This wasn't about survival. This was about proving himself, and the stakes felt just as high. Clint Eastwood had given him an opening, a rare crack in the door of opportunity. Now it was up to Jake to push it wide open. But doubt was a persistent enemy. I'm just a guard, Jake thought as he stared at his scattered notes after his shift. What do I know that people with titles and degrees don't? But then he'd remember Clint's words. Doing your best doesn't always mean it's enough. It wasn't just advice. It was a challenge. Clint had seen something in Jake, something even Jake wasn't sure existed. That thought alone kept him going. Every night after his shifts, Jake stayed late. Long after the building had emptied, he roamed its halls, not as a guard, but as an investigator. He studied every security checkpoint, every blind spot in the surveillance system, every door that seemed just a little too easy to bypass. He wasn't just looking, he was dissecting. His military instincts kicked in. The same attention to detail that had kept him alive overseas was now focused on blueprints and security protocols. He found weaknesses others had overlooked: outdated access codes, camera angles with blind spots, and emergency protocols that left gaps wide enough for a breach. Jake's small apartment turned into a war room. Papers were pinned to the walls, security schematics spread across the floor. He barely slept, surviving on cheap coffee, and the gnawing fear that if he failed, this once-in-a-lifetime chance would disappear. But the hardest battle wasn't with the building's flaws, it was with his own self-doubt. What if Clint was just being polite? What if he doesn't even remember me? That question haunted him, yet he kept working. Because deep down Jake wasn't just preparing for Clint Eastwood, he was preparing for himself, to prove that he wasn't just another nameless guard standing in the shadows. Weeks passed, and Jake's notes turned into a detailed report, a plan not just to point out flaws but to fix them, real solutions backed by strategy and experience. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best he had. Then, one evening, as Jake reviewed his notes for the 100th time, headlights pierced the darkness outside the building. The same sleek black car rolled in. The door opened. Clint Eastwood had returned. Jake's heart raced, but he stood tall. This time he was ready, not just with answers, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had done the work. Clint approached, his sharp gaze steady. No formal greetings, no small talk. "I told you I'd be back," Clint said, his voice like gravel and steel. "Let's hear what you've got." Jake took a deep breath. This was it. The moment Jake had been preparing for had finally arrived. Clint Eastwood stood in front of him again, his piercing gaze sharp enough to cut through the cold night air. There were no formalities, no polite small talk, just the weight of expectation hanging in the space between them. Clint's presence alone carried the gravity of 1,000 unspoken words. "I told you I'd be back," Clint said simply, his voice low and steady. "Let's hear what you've got." Jake's heart pounded, but he pushed the nerves aside. This was the moment he'd worked countless sleepless nights for. No more excuses, no more doubt. "Yes, sir," Jake replied, his voice firm. He led Clint to a small security office tucked away from the bustling hallways, its walls covered with blueprints, notes, and hand-drawn diagrams. The room, usually dull and lifeless, now felt like a war room, each detail meticulously prepared for this exact meeting. Jake didn't waste time. He launched into his assessment, pointing out the building's vulnerabilities with military precision: blind spots in surveillance coverage, outdated security protocols, weak access points. Jake outlined them all. He didn't just highlight problems. He offered solutions, drawing from both his military experience and hours of obsessive research. Clint stood silently, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod in approval. He simply listened. Jake's voice remained steady, even as doubt tried to creep in. Is this good enough? Am I wasting his time? But he kept going, driven by the thought that this was his one shot. When he finally finished, the room fell into silence. Clint didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a slow nod, he broke the silence. "I like the way you think." Jake exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, but it was brief because Clint wasn't done. Turning to one of his aides, Clint spoke with quiet authority. "Set up a meeting. I want to see what he's capable of." Jake's heart skipped a beat. A meeting? What did that mean? Was this real? Before he could process it, Clint turned back to him. "You've got potential, Thompson. Don't waste it." With that, Clint walked out, leaving Jake standing alone in the dimly lit office, his mind racing. This wasn't just a casual acknowledgement. This was the beginning of something bigger than he'd ever imagined. But fate wasn't going to give him time to celebrate. Later that very night, as the city slept and the building fell into its usual eerie silence, the security alarms blared to life. Jake's theories, his plans, his instincts, they were about to face the ultimate test. The piercing shriek of the alarm shattered the stillness of the night. Red lights flashed, casting eerie shadows across the empty corridors of the government building. Jake Thompson's heart jolted, not from fear, but from adrenaline, sharp and cold, flooding his system like it had on the battlefield years ago. Rushing into the security control room, Jake was met with chaos. Officers scrambled, voices overlapping in a storm of confusion. Unauthorized breach detected. Could be a system glitch. No signs of forced entry. Jake's eyes darted to the surveillance monitors. There, moving swiftly through the shadows of a restricted corridor, was a figure. No broken locks, no shattered glass, just a shadow slipping through the cracks, the very cracks Jake had flagged in his report. This wasn't a glitch. It was real. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed the radio. His voice cut through the panic with razor-sharp clarity. "We have an intruder. I need a tactical team to the southwest corridor, now." But hesitation rippled through the room. The other guards exchanged uncertain glances. Jake wasn't in charge. He was just a guard, until a familiar, gravelly voice snapped through the tension like a whip. "Do as he says." Jake turned to see Clint Eastwood standing in the doorway, his expression carved from stone. No fear, no hesitation, just absolute authority. The room fell into immediate, disciplined silence. With Clint's command behind him, Jake led the charge. The team moved swiftly through the dimly lit hallways, their footsteps echoing like drumbeats of war. Jake's military instincts roared to life, analyzing, anticipating, commanding. They reached the corridor, but it was empty, too empty. Jake scanned the space, his eyes sharp, heart pounding like a war drum. Then he saw it, a faint smudge on the floor near an access panel, barely noticeable to anyone else. He signaled the team to spread out, then crouched down, his fingers tracing the outline of the panel. "Here," he whispered. Carefully, they pried it open. Tucked inside wasn't just an intruder, it was something worse. A small, sophisticated device wired directly into the building's security network. A data interception tool designed to bypass every protocol and gain control from within. It was a silent breach, meant to leave no trace, if Jake hadn't caught it in time. Clint stepped forward, kneeling beside Jake. He picked up the device, turning it over in his weathered hands, his jaw tightened, his steely eyes locking onto Jake's. "You see?" Clint muttered, his voice low but filled with weight. "Doing your best isn't always enough." Jake's chest tightened. Not from fear, but from the gravity of what they'd just prevented. This wasn't a theory anymore. It wasn't a report on paper. It was real. Lives could have been at stake. The building's entire security compromised, if not for him. Clint stood, his gaze never leaving Jake's face. "You've got good instincts," he said. "And instincts like that, they don't belong behind a guard's desk." The words hit harder than any bullet Jake had ever dodged. Because for the first time, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't just a name on a roster. He was seen, valued. But the night wasn't over. This wasn't just a breach. It was the beginning of something bigger. And Jake Thompson had just stepped into a world where the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the government building. But for Jake Thompson, the darkness of the night before still lingered. Not as fear, but as the memory of the moment that changed everything. He stood alone in a small office, the sterile fluorescent light flickering overhead. On the desk in front of him lay an official document, a temporary assignment as a security advisor. His name, once buried in the background of daily rosters, was now printed boldly at the top, a title he never imagined would follow his own. But it wasn't just the title. It was what it represented. Jake wasn't the man he had been weeks ago, the invisible guard who blended into the walls he protected. He had stepped out of the shadows, proven not just his skills but his worth. Not because someone handed it to him, but because he took it when the opportunity knocked. And that opportunity had a name: Clint Eastwood. Yet this was no victory lap. Along with the assignment came a challenge. Within 1 week, Jake was tasked to submit a comprehensive security overhaul, a report detailing every vulnerability, every flaw, and a realistic plan to eliminate them. A task that would normally take a seasoned team of experts a month. Jake felt the weight of it immediately. "I'm not an expert. I'm just a guard," the voice in his head whispered. But then he remembered Clint's words, spoken with that signature grit. "I didn't pick you because you have all the answers. I picked you because you know how to find them." So Jake got to work. Long nights turned into longer mornings. He pored over building schematics, analyzed surveillance footage, and revisited every inch of the facility he'd once thought he knew. But now, he wasn't looking through the eyes of a guard. He was thinking like a strategist. Frustration hit hard on the fourth night. His notes were a mess, scattered across the desk like fragments of a puzzle he couldn't solve. Doubt crept in again, louder this time. "What am I even doing here?" And then the door creaked open. Clint Eastwood stepped inside, alone, without the entourage or security detail that usually followed him. He glanced at Jake's scattered papers, then pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "How far have you gotten?" Clint asked, his voice calm, almost casual. Jake sighed, pushing a few documents forward. "I've identified some weak points, but putting it all together, I don't know if I'm cut out for this." Clint leaned back, his gaze steady. "Do you know what separates a leader from everyone else?" Jake shook his head. "They don't need to have all the answers," Clint said. "They just need to know how to find them." Those words hit harder than any critique. Because it wasn't advice, it was the truth. Jake didn't finish that report alone. He reached out, gathered insights from tech specialists, cybersecurity experts, even fellow guards who'd been overlooked just like him. He didn't see it as weakness anymore. He saw it as leadership. By the end of the week, Jake submitted a report that didn't just meet expectations, it redefined them. But life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. At exactly 1:47 a.m., the piercing wail of an alarm shattered the quiet once again. Unauthorized breach, same building, new threat. But this time there was no hesitation. Jake sprinted into action, issuing commands with the authority of a man who'd earned it. His team moved with precision because they trusted him. And when they neutralized the threat, an even more sophisticated breach than before, Jake didn't need validation. Because Clint Eastwood was already standing there watching from the shadows with a rare approving nod. Jake had started this journey as an invisible guard, but through courage, resilience, and the quiet belief that he was meant for more, he transformed into a leader. Not because of a title, not because Clint Eastwood believed in him, but because he finally believed in himself. Jake Thompson's story isn't just about a man who went from being an invisible security guard to a respected leader. It's about what happens when someone dares to believe they're capable of more, when they stop waiting for recognition and start creating their own opportunity. Think about it. How many people out there are just like Jake? Talented, hardworking, overlooked, not because they lack potential, but because no one ever gave them the chance to prove it. Maybe that's you. Maybe you've been standing in the shadows waiting for someone to notice, for the right moment to arrive. But here's the truth. The right moment doesn't come to you. You create it. Jake didn't change his life because Clint Eastwood handed him an opportunity. He changed it because when the door cracked open, even just a little, he kicked it wide with everything he had. He stayed up late, faced his doubts, and put in the work no one saw. And when the real test came, he didn't flinch. He led. So ask yourself, what's your opportunity? What's the challenge you've been too afraid to face? Because maybe the next story isn't about Jake Thompson. Maybe it's about you. If this story inspired you, drop a comment below. Have you ever had a moment that changed your life? Or are you still waiting for your chance to prove yourself? Don't be afraid to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire someone else. And if you found this meaningful, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are more powerful stories waiting to be told. Stories that might just be the spark you've been waiting for. Thanks for watching, and remember, when opportunity knocks, don't hesitate to open the door.